The wind on Cuttyhunk Island did not merely blow, it sang with the voices of two continents. To young Paul Cuffe, standing on the jagged edge of the Elizabeth Islands, where the Atlantic churned into foam, the air tasted of salt and ancient history. He was a boy born of a collision, the son of Cuffe, an Ashanti man who had survived the Middle Passage to buy his own soul, and Ruth Moses, a woman of the Wampanoag, whose people had known these tides since the world was new. In 1772, the salt air turned bitter. Paul was 13 when his father, the man the Quakers called Coffee Slocum, breathed his last. Cuffe had been a giant in Paul's eyes, a man who had carved a 116-acre farm out of the Dartmouth soil with hands once shackled. He left behind a legacy of iron-willed independence and a family of 10 children who looked to Paul and his brother John to hold the horizon against the storm.
By 14, he was no longer a child of the furrowed field. He was a mariner. He signed onto a whaling vessel bound for the West Indies, trading the steady footing of the Massachusetts mainland for the violent, tilting world of the harpoon and the mast. On the deck of a whaler, the color of a man's skin mattered less than the strength of his grip on a line during a gale. Paul watched the stars with an intensity that bordered on the religious, mapping the constellations of the northern hemisphere until he could navigate by the silver fire of the night sky alone. He wasn't just learning to sail, he was learning to command. But the world was fracturing. By 1776, the air in the colonies was thick with the smoke of rebellion. The Revolutionary War turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. On a voyage that same year, the British Navy, like a great grey shark, intercepted Paul's vessel.
He was seized, a free-born man of color, caught in the gears of a white man's war, and cast into a prison ship in the harbor of New York. For 3 months, Paul lived in a wooden purgatory. The air was a soup of rot and fever. The screams of dying patriots echoed through the hull. It was there, in the darkness, that the fire of his abolitionism was truly stoked. He saw the hypocrisy of a nation crying for liberty while keeping half its brothers in chains. When he was finally released, he walked back to Westport, not as a victim, but as a man who understood that freedom was something that had to be built plank by plank. The war had closed the ports, but Nantucket was starving for goods. In 1779, Paul and his brother David stood before a small open sailboat. The British blockade sat on the horizon like a wall of iron. "It is suicide," David said, his voice trembling as the waves slapped the hull. "It is trade," Paul replied, his eyes fixed on the grey expanse.
"And it is our right." They set out under the cover of a moonless night. The pirates of the Sound, lawless men who preyed on any flag, pursued them. On one voyage, they were waylaid, their cargo plundered, their boat nearly scuttled. But Paul returned, refitted, and went again. He learned the secret inlets, the timing of the tides, and the exact moment to slip past the British frigates. When he finally walked onto the docks of Nantucket with a hold full of supplies, he didn't just bring cargo, he brought the proof that a man of color could outmaneuver the greatest navy on earth. Yet, as he returned to the mainland, a different kind of blockade awaited him. In 1780, At the age of 21, Paul looked at the tax bill presented by the Bristol County officials. He looked at his brother John, then at the document that demanded the fruits of their labor to fund a government that denied them a voice.
"They say we are citizens when the tax collector knocks," Paul said, his voice a low rumble of Ashanti thunder and Wampanoag resolve. "But they say we are nothing when the ballot box is opened." The Cuffe brothers did the unthinkable. They refused to pay. They petitioned the Council of Bristol County, their words sharp as a ship's prow. They argued that taxation without representation was the very tyranny the colonies claimed to be fighting. It was a dangerous gambit. The authorities moved to arrest them, but Paul did not flinch. He walked into the halls of power, not as a petitioner, but as an equal. Though the local suit was initially denied, the ripples of his defiance spread. By 1783, the Massachusetts legislature, moved by the logic of men who would rather go to jail than be silent, granted the right to vote to all free male citizens. Paul stood on the banks of the Aquaxit River as the war ended. He was 24, a veteran of prison, pirates, and political fire.
He turned his gaze toward the timber-rich forests of Westport. He would no longer sail other men's ships. With his brother-in-law Michael Wayner, he began to lay the keel of his own destiny. He didn't just want a boat, he wanted a fleet. He didn't just want a farm, he wanted a school where children of all races could learn that the horizon belonged to those who dared to sail toward it. As the first mallet struck the oak of his new shipyard, Paul Cuffe knew the wind was rising. The world was wide, and he was finally the captain of his own soul.
The oak of the Westport River didn't just provide timber. It provided a language for Paul Cuffe's ambition. By 1787, the shipyard he built with Michael Wayner was a symphony of adze strikes and handsaws. They launched the 25-ton schooner Sunfish, a vessel that felt more like a promise than a boat. But Paul's eyes were always on a wider horizon. He followed the Sunfish with the Mary, and then the 69-ton Ranger. Each haul was a testament to his father's Ashanti persistence and his mother's Wampanoag connection to the coastal winds. By the turn of the century, the boy who had once been a prisoner of war in New York was now one of the wealthiest men of color in the young United States. He stood on the deck of the Hero, a 162-ton bark, and later the Alpha, a massive 268-ton ship that commanded respect in every port from Savannah to Gothenburg. Yet, wealth was never Paul's final port of call.
He walked the streets of Westport in the plain, unadorned clothes of a Quaker, having found a spiritual home within the Society of Friends. The silence of the meeting house appealed to him. The idea that the inner light burned in every soul, regardless of the skin that housed it. But he found that even among the friends, the light sometimes struggled against the shadows of the world. When he looked at his 7 children, Naomi, Mary, Ruth, Alice, Paul Jr., Rhoda, and William, he saw the future. When the local school refused to admit them because of their heritage, Paul didn't merely protest. He acted with the same decisiveness he used to navigate a gale. On his own land, with his own money, he built a schoolhouse and opened its doors to the entire community. Education is the chart by which we find our way, he told Alice, his wife, whose Wampanoag strength was the anchor of their home. If they will not give our children the tools to build, we shall build the forge ourselves. It was the first racially integrated school in the nation, a quiet revolution carved in cedar and pine. But a larger calling was beginning to pull at him. Across the Atlantic, the British colony of Sierra Leone was struggling.
It was a place where former slaves, many of whom had fought for the British during the Revolution, had been resettled. Paul heard their cry for stability and industry. He didn't see a charity case. He saw a commercial and moral opportunity to prove that Africa could flourish through legitimate trade rather than the horror of the slave trade. In 1811, Paul took his favorite ship, the Traveller, toward the coast of West Africa. When the Traveller sailed into Liverpool later that year, the British press was stunned. The Times reported with a mix of awe and disbelief that a vessel entirely owned and navigated by Negroes had reached their shores.
Paul moved through the high circles of London abolitionists, men like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, not as a curiosity, but as a peer. He proposed a friendly society in Sierra Leone, a network of black entrepreneurs who would trade in whale oil, salt, and timber. However, the world was shifting back toward chaos. As Paul sailed home in 1812, the winds of war between the United States and Britain were rising again. Off the coast of Rhode Island, the Traveller was intercepted by U.S. customs agents. They seized his ship and his cargo, accusing him of violating the embargo against British goods. Paul did not despair. He did not retreat to his farm. He traveled to Washington, D.C., a city built on the labor of the enslaved, to seek an audience with the President of the United States. In the White House, James Madison looked at the man standing before him. Paul Cuffe stood tall, his Quaker hat in his hand, his gaze steady.
He was perhaps the first African American to be received as an official guest in those halls. Paul spoke of Sierra Leone, of the potential for a new era of commerce, and of the injustice of the seizure. Madison, a man who grappled with the problem of slavery while holding hundreds in his grip, was struck by Cuffe's intelligence and dignity. "I seek only the right to move freely upon the seas God provided for us all," Paul said. Madison ordered the cargo returned. But the victory was bittersweet. The War of 1812 erupted shortly after, a wall of fire across the Atlantic that trapped Paul's ships in harbor for 3 long years. He watched his wealth diminish as the hero was declared unseaworthy in far-off Chile, and his partners lost money in Philadelphia. Yet, in the quiet of the Westport meeting house, Paul found a new clarity. The war had stopped his ships, but it had not stopped his vision. He began to realize that his mission was no longer just about trade.
It was about a homecoming. As the Treaty of Ghent finally brought peace in 1814, Paul Cuffe began to prepare the Traveller for its most important voyage yet. He wasn't just bringing axes and plows this time. He was bringing families. He was bringing hope. And he was doing it at a cost that would either cement his legacy or break his fortune forever. On the morning of December 10, 1815, the Westport docks were gripped by a frost that turned the breath of men into ghosts. Paul Cuffe stood on the deck of the Traveller, his hands, calloused by 40 years of salt and rope, resting on the railing. Beside him stood 38 free black souls, 18 adults and 20 children, including William Gwyn and his family. They were not merely passengers, they were the seeds of a new world. Paul had spent over $4,000 of his own fortune to outpace the slow machinery of government and charity. He knew the risks. His wealth, once a mountain, had been eroded by the war and the treachery of distant partners. But as he looked into the eyes of the children, ranging from infants to teenagers, he saw a debt that surpassed gold. He was the son of Cuffe, the Ashanti who had bought his own breath from the Slocums, and Ruth, the Wampanoag woman who knew that the land and sea belonged to no man, only to the Creator.
In Paul, these two lineages of resilience converged into a single steering purpose. The 54-day crossing was a crucible of wind and prayer. In the cramped quarters of the Traveller, Paul served as captain, father, and Quaker elder. He taught the men the mechanics of the plow and the saw. He spoke to the women of the friendly society they would build to sustain one another. When the lush, jagged coastline of Sierra Leone finally rose from the haze on February 3, 1816, a cheer went up that seemed to quiet the very waves. But the Africa that greeted Paul was not the paradise of his dreams. It was a colony strangled by the cold fingers of bureaucracy. Governor McCarthy, harassed by local unrest and the rigid demands of the British Crown, met Paul with a face of stone. He demanded oaths of allegiance that smacked of the very chains the settlers had fled. He imposed tariffs that bled Paul's remaining capital dry.
The British African Institution, which had once lauded Paul in the glittering halls of London, now turned a deaf ear to his pleas for reinvestment. Paul watched as his cargo of axes, hoes, and wagons sold for a pittance. He calculated his losses, over $8,000, a staggering sum that would have broken a lesser man. Yet as he walked through Freetown and saw the 38 settlers finding their footing, building homes and planting the seeds of an integrated economy, he did not regret a single cent. He had proven that the sons and daughters of Africa could return, not as subjects, but as architects of their own destiny. When Paul returned to New York in 1816, he found a nation in the throes of a new fever. The American Colonization Society had formed, led by men like Henry Clay, men who spoke of Africa as a dumping ground for troublesome free blacks rather than a land of opportunity. They sought Paul's blessing, craving the legitimacy of his name.
"I seek the elevation of my people," Paul told the ACS representatives, his voice steady even as his body began to fail him. "Not their banishment. If they go, they must go as free men seeking a horizon, not as outcasts driven by your fear." He withdrew to Westport, the salt air of his childhood home providing a final, bitter comfort. His strength was spent. The years of navigating blockades, fighting pirates, petitioning presidents, and defying the gravity of racial caste had finally claimed his heart. In early 1817, the great navigator took to his bed. His mind wandered back to Cuttyhunk, to the sheep his father had tended, and to the silent, powerful meetings of the Friends, where the inner light burned brightest. On September 7, 1817, the room was filled with the soft ticking of a clock and the distant rhythm of the Akoakset River hitting the hulls of ships in his yard. His family gathered close. His longtime friend, William Roch Jr., sat in heavy-hearted silence.
Paul opened his eyes one last time. He did not look at the ledgers that showed a diminished estate, nor at the maps of the world he had helped redraw. He looked at the faces of his children, the legacy of a Wampanoag Ashanti Union that had defied every law of the age. "Let me pass quietly away," he whispered. He died as he had lived, in the profound, disciplined silence of a Quaker, but with the vast, uncontainable spirit of a mariner. Over 200 people, black, white, and native, followed his coffin to the graveyard behind the Westport Friends meeting house. They buried him in the earth his father had labored to own, within earshot of the sea he had conquered. Paul Cuffe left behind a world that was still burning, still shackled, but he had left a permanent wake in the water. He had proven that a man's worth was not dictated by the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth, but by the distance he was willing to sail for the sake of his brother.
The traveler was moored, but the journey toward the horizon of justice had only just begun.